The Galactic Taming Guild's orbital station floated in the darkness of space like a massive steel fortress. Inside its walls, something terrible was happening. For 3 months straight, the facility had watched 147 of the galaxy's best tamers walk into one particular containment chamber. Not a single one had lasted more than an hour with what waited inside. The Emperor's dragon, Shadowfang, had always been magnificent. A creature of legend, really. 40 feet of pure obsidian scales that gleamed like polished stone, wings that could block out suns, and eyes that burned with ancient intelligence. But that was before the attack. Before Handler Brooks died right in front of the dragon, cut down by assassins who thought killing the handler would weaken the Emperor's power. They were wrong about that. What they created was so much worse. Shadowfang didn't just go wild. Wild animals could be handled. Wild animals followed patterns, instincts, predictable behaviors. No, Shadowfang had shattered into something the galaxy had never seen before. The dragon's psychic screams were so powerful they could crack reinforced observation glass 3 feet thick. Its plasma breath, once carefully controlled, now melted through containment fields designed to hold small stars. And its tail, thrashing in endless rage and grief, had put 12 of the guild's elite tamers in medical bays with injuries that would take months to heal. The guild had tried everything. They brought in the best psychic specialists from 6 different star systems. These were beings who could calm raging beasts with a thought, who could share minds with creatures humans couldn't even pronounce the names of. Shadowfang had nearly killed them all. They tried beast whisperers from ancient worlds where talking to animals was as natural as breathing. The dragon wouldn't even acknowledge their presence before attacking. They tried technology next. Sonic dampeners, neural suppressors, holographic projections of Handler Brooks. Nothing worked. If anything, the attempts to trick or force the dragon into compliance made things worse. 2 technicians were still recovering from the incident with the hologram. Shadowfang had recognized the deception immediately and responded with a fury that had everyone evacuating 3 entire sections of the station. Then Jake Reynolds showed up. He didn't arrive in a fancy ship. No entourage of assistants. No specialized equipment being unloaded by cargo drones. Just one man with a worn military duffel bag slung over his shoulder, walking down the docking ramp like he was arriving for any regular job. The bag looked old, beaten up from years of use, with faded unit patches sewn onto the fabric. When security scanned it, they found nothing impressive. Some clothes, a thermos, a music player that looked 20 years out of date, and children's drawings. Lots and lots of children's drawings. Jake himself looked even less impressive than his luggage. He was in his early 40s, with lines around his eyes that spoke of too many sleepless nights and gray creeping into his dark hair. His jacket had seen better days. His boots were scuffed. He had the kind of tired look that came from carrying weight that never got lighter, the kind of exhaustion that sleep couldn't fix. The other tamers in the facility looked at him like he was a joke. Here was this human, from a species most of the galaxy still considered primitive, thinking he could succeed where the greatest experts had failed. The whispers started immediately. Some aliens laughed openly. Others just shook their heads, already planning how long it would take to clean up after another failure. Commander Voth, the facility's coordinator, was a towering figure from a species that communicated partially through color-shifting facial plates. Right now, those plates were showing deep skepticism mixed with a hint of pity. She'd seen 147 tamers fail. She'd signed off on medical transports for the injured. She'd had to comfort families. And now here was this unremarkable human who thought he could do better. Still, orders were orders. The Emperor himself had opened the contract to anyone, any species, any background. If this human wanted to try, she couldn't stop him. She led Jake through the facility's corridors, past observation rooms where other tamers monitored dangerous creatures, past training facilities where handlers worked with more cooperative beasts. The facility was impressive, filled with technology that could analyze a creature's DNA in seconds or project training simulations indistinguishable from reality. Jake barely looked at any of it. He just followed quietly, his duffel bag over one shoulder, his eyes taking in everything without seeming particularly impressed or intimidated. They reached the observation deck. It was a large room with one wall made entirely of transparent alloy, 6 inches thick, the strongest material the guild could manufacture. It had to be. Beyond that wall was Shadowfang's containment chamber. The lights in the chamber were already dim, but even in the darkness, the dragon was visible. 40 feet of coiled rage and misery. Its obsidian scales, once polished and beautiful, were now scratched and damaged from weeks of throwing itself against walls. Its wings, magnificent things that could have stretched 100 feet, were torn and tattered. The dragon had been hurting itself over and over and nobody could stop it. But it was the eyes that got to you. They glowed amber in the darkness, but there was no intelligence in them anymore. Just pain. Raw, endless pain that had consumed everything else the dragon used to be. As Jake and Commander Voth approached the observation window, Shadowfang's head snapped toward them. The dragon's mouth opened, and even through 6 inches of reinforced alloy, the psychic scream hit like a physical force. Jake saw the observation window flex slightly. A crack that had been repaired before showed stress marks. Commander Voth's facial plates shifted through several colors that probably meant she was uncomfortable. Most beings flinched when Shadowfang screamed. Some ran. But Jake just stood there, hands in his pockets, watching the dragon with quiet eyes. He'd heard worse sounds. In the war, in field hospitals, in the middle of the night when memories wouldn't stay buried. This was just another kind of pain and he recognized it. 1 hour, Commander Voth said, her voice translator making her words clear despite her alien physiology. That's what we'll give you. The same chance everyone else got. After that, emergency extraction. Jake didn't respond immediately. He just kept watching the dragon, seeing things the sensors and psychic scans couldn't detect. He saw how Shadowfang moved, how the dragon's breathing was irregular, how its eyes kept darting to the spot where Handler Brooks must have fallen. I'll need my kit, Jake finally said, his voice quiet and steady. And I'll need you to dim the lights even further. Also, do you have the previous handler's personal effects? Commander Voth's facial plates shifted to a color Jake's briefing had told him meant surprise. Handler Brooks' belongings? Why would you need? Just trust me, Jake interrupted, still not looking away from the dragon. The observation deck was packed with every tamer, handler, and specialist still on the station. Word had spread fast that the human was actually going inside. They crowded around monitors, some standing on chairs to get a better view, others pulling up holographic displays on their personal devices. Nobody wanted to miss this. Most were placing bets on how quickly the human would panic and hit the emergency extraction button. The current record was 43 minutes, held by a psychic master who'd trained for 15 years before even attempting dragon work. Jake stood at the entrance to the containment chamber, his duffel bag at his feet. Commander Voth ran through the safety protocols one last time, her facial plates cycling through colors that Jake had learned meant concern. The emergency extraction system. The panic button clipped to his belt. The medical team standing by. The automated systems that would flood the chamber with suppression gas if his vital signs flatlined. Jake listened politely, but his mind was elsewhere. He was thinking about the blanket in his bag, still sealed in the storage container they'd retrieved from Handler Brooks' personal quarters. He was thinking about the music file he'd found in the facility's records, a playlist Brooks had listened to during training sessions. He was thinking about his daughter Lily, probably in class right now back on Earth, drawing pictures in the margins of her schoolwork when the teacher wasn't looking. The medical bills were crushing him. Veterans' benefits covered some of it, but Lily's condition required specialists, treatments that insurance companies called experimental. He'd taken every extra shift he could at the colony's animal rescue center, but it wasn't enough. When the guild's open contract had appeared on his feed, offering more money than he'd make in 5 years, he'd applied without really thinking he'd get selected. Now here he was, about to walk into a room with a creature that had hospitalized or killed some of the galaxy's best. Ready? Commander Voth asked, her translator giving the word a weight that suggested she thought he wasn't. As I'll ever be, Jake replied. The containment door opened with a hiss of pressurized air. Beyond it, darkness. They dimmed the lights like he'd asked, bringing them down to almost nothing. Just enough to see shapes and shadows. Jake picked up his duffel bag and walked inside. The door sealed behind him with a sound like a tomb closing. Every screen in the observation deck showed the same image now. Jake Reynolds standing alone in the darkness, a dragon somewhere in the shadows beyond the camera's range. The watchers held their breath. Jake set down his bag and knelt beside it, moving slowly, deliberately. He pulled out the thermos first, unscrewed the cap, and the smell of fresh coffee filled the air. Real coffee, not the synthetic stuff most of the station served. He'd paid extra for it at the docking bay shop, knowing he'd need something familiar, something human, something real. Then came the blanket. Still in its storage container. He opened it carefully, and even through the monitors, the other tamers saw the way Jake's hands moved with respect. This wasn't just any blanket. This had belonged to someone. This had meant something. The music player was last. Small, old, the kind of device that people kept because it had sentimental value rather than because it was the best technology available. That's when Shadowfang struck. The dragon had been waiting in the darkness, coiled and silent. Now it exploded forward with a speed that shouldn't have been possible for something so massive. Its jaws opened wide, teeth like swords, each one capable of shearing through steel. The attack was so fast that the automated safety systems didn't even have time to activate. In the observation deck, someone screamed. Commander Voth reached for the emergency override. Medics grabbed their equipment and ran toward the containment level. But Jake didn't move. He didn't run. Didn't dive for cover. Didn't reach for the panic button on his belt. He simply sat down, crossing his legs like he was settling in for a picnic, and poured coffee from his thermos into the cap that served as a cup. Shadowfang's attack stopped inches from Jake's head. Close enough that Jake could feel the heat from the dragon's breath, could smell the ozone scent of built-up plasma. Close enough that one twitch, one flinch would have been the end. But Jake just sat there looking at his coffee, not making eye contact with the dragon looming over him. The containment chamber was silent except for Shadowfang's breathing, heavy and ragged. The dragon's head hovered there, jaws still open, confused. Every other human, every other tamer, every other being that had entered this chamber had run. Had fought. Had tried to dominate or control or escape. This one was just sitting there. Drinking coffee. "Yeah, I know," Jake said softly, his voice barely above a whisper but picked up clearly by the chamber's audio sensors. "The whole universe expects you to perform. To be what you were. To be strong and fierce and under control. But you can't do that right now, can you?" Shadowfang's growl started low, building into something that should have turned Jake's insides to jelly. The psychic force of it made the observation windows flex. 3 monitors in the deck shorted out from the interference. One of the psychic specialists grabbed his head in pain, even through all the shielding. Jake took a sip of his coffee. His hand was steady. "Everything hurts," Jake continued, still not looking at the dragon directly. "And nothing makes sense anymore. The person who mattered most is gone and everyone keeps telling you to move on, to get back to normal, to be functional. But there is no normal anymore. There's just this weight that never gets lighter." He paused, taking another sip. The coffee was good. Strong and bitter and real. "Lost my wife 4 years ago," Jake said, and his voice carried the kind of tired that came from saying true things that hurt. "Car accident. Random. Stupid. One minute she was there, next minute she wasn't. Lily, my daughter, she was only 6 years old. Suddenly it was just the 2 of us and I had no idea what I was doing." Shadowfang's growl had faded. The dragon's massive head tilted slightly, one amber eye focusing on the small human sitting cross-legged on the floor. "Everyone had advice," Jake said. "Doctors, therapists, well-meaning friends. They said I needed to be strong for Lily. Process my grief. Move forward. Get back to work. Keep functioning. And I tried. I really did. But some nights, after Lily was asleep, I'd go outside and I'd just want to scream. Want to tear the world apart with my bare hands. Want to make everything hurt the way I was hurting." He reached into his bag and pulled out the blanket, still handling it with care. He unfolded it slowly, and the scent that came from it made Shadowfang's entire body go still. Handler Brooks. The dragon could smell Handler Brooks. "But I couldn't do that," Jake said. "Couldn't tear the world apart. Because Lily needed me. And you know what I learned? Sometimes the bravest thing isn't being strong. Sometimes it's just surviving one more day when you don't want to." Jake pulled out the music player, set it on the floor between himself and the dragon and pressed play. Soft instrumental music filled the chamber. According to the files Jake had studied, Handler Brooks had played this during every training session. During every flight. During quiet moments when human and dragon had simply existed together. Shadowfang's breathing changed. The dragon's body, coiled tight with rage and pain, began to loosen. Not because of control. Not because of dominance or psychic manipulation or fear. But because of recognition. Because something familiar, something that meant safety and love and better times, had entered this darkness. The dragon slowly, carefully lowered its head to the floor. Still watching Jake. Still tense. But no longer attacking. Jake sipped his coffee and let the music play. In the observation deck, nobody moved. Nobody spoke. The chronometer on the wall ticked forward. 30 minutes. 40 minutes. 50 minutes. 1 hour passed. Jake Reynolds remained alive. The first person to do so since Shadowfang had broken. 3 days into what everyone had assumed would be a disaster, something impossible was happening aboard the orbital station. Shadowfang still wouldn't eat the food the handlers left. The dragon still flinched away when anyone besides Jake got too close to the containment chamber. Physical contact remained absolutely off the table. But the attacks had stopped. The psychic screams that had cracked observation windows were gone. The thrashing that had put 12 Tamers in medical bays had ceased. Jake had essentially moved into the containment chamber. He'd requested a sleeping roll, some basic supplies and permission to stay for 12-hour shifts. Commander Voth had approved it, partly because she was curious, partly because she was seeing results nobody else had achieved, and partly because the emergency medical team was getting tired of being on constant standby. The other Tamers couldn't make sense of it. They gathered in the observation deck during their breaks, watching the security feeds like they were studying some kind of puzzle. Here was this unremarkable human sitting on the floor of a dragon's containment chamber just talking. Not doing anything special. Not using any equipment. Just existing in the space with a creature that had nearly killed the galaxy's best handlers. A psychic specialist named Trevor became obsessed with figuring it out. He was from a species that could read emotional states across vast distances, who could calm aggressive animals with focused thought. He'd spent 40 years perfecting his craft. And he'd lasted 18 minutes with Shadow Fong before the dragon's mental assault had left him unconscious for 2 days. There has to be something we're missing, Trevor insisted, manipulating holographic displays that showed Jake's biometric data. Some latent psychic ability in humans that we haven't documented. Maybe his brain waves are operating on a frequency that resonates with dragon neurology. Other specialists crowded around, offering theories. Maybe humans produced pheromones that affected dragon behavior. Maybe there was something in Jake's body chemistry, some combination of hormones or enzymes that created a calming effect. Maybe Earth's gravity was different enough that humans moved in ways that seemed non-threatening to massive predators. They ran tests, pulled up comparative data on human physiology, debated theories that got increasingly complex and scientific. Meanwhile, on the monitors, Jake was telling Shadow Fong about his daughter's school project. So Lily's class is doing this thing where they grow beans in cups, Jake was saying, his voice carrying clearly through the audio feed. Just dirt and water and bean seeds. Basic science, right? But she's so excited about it. Checks on it every morning before school. Named the plant Gerald. I don't know why Gerald. I asked her and she just shrugged and said it looked like a Gerald. Shadow Fong lay in the darkness about 20 feet away, head resting on the floor, those amber eyes fixed on Jake. The dragon's breathing was steady now, no longer the ragged, painful sound it had been for weeks. Anyway, she's convinced Gerald is going to be the biggest bean plant in the class, Jake continued, pouring himself more coffee from his eternal thermos. She's drawing pictures of it, planning where we're going to plant it in the garden when it gets bigger. I don't have the heart to tell her that bean plants don't exactly get huge. Let her dream, you know? Commander Voth had been watching the feeds quietly while the specialists debated. She'd been in this business for 30 years, had worked with hundreds of species, thousands of handlers. She'd seen every technique, every approach, every method the guild had developed over centuries. And suddenly she understood what she was looking at. Stop, she said, her facial plates shifting to a color that commanded attention. The specialist fell silent. You're all looking at this wrong. She gestured at the main screen where Jake was now talking about his plans for a garden, something about tomatoes and whether he should try growing peppers. He's not using a technique. He's not taming the dragon at all. Trevor looked confused, his translator struggling to convey his species equivalent of a frown. Then what is he doing? He's mourning with it, Commander Voth said simply. Look at his breathing. Really look. She pulled up a split screen showing Jake's respiratory rate next to Shadowfang's. The patterns matched almost perfectly. When the dragon's breathing slowed, so did Jake's. When it quickened, Jake's followed. He's not trying to dominate or control or fix the dragon, she explained, pointing at different data streams. He's not using patience as a technique. He's just being patient. He's letting Shadow Fong feel what it needs to feel. He's sitting with the pain instead of trying to make it go away. One of the younger handlers, a being from a species that processed information through color perception, spoke up. But that's not how we're trained. The guild protocols say to establish dominance, create structure, redirect aggressive energy into productive channels. Yes, Commander Voth agreed. And how well did those protocols work with Shadow Fong? Silence. The answer was obvious. 147 failures spoke for themselves. On the monitor, Jake was checking something on his personal data pad. It was day 5 now and he'd brought something new with him for this shift. Pictures. Hey, so I wanted to show you something, Jake said to the dragon, his tone shifting to something softer, more personal. He held up the data pad so Shadow Fong could see the screen. This is Lily. This is why I'm here in case you were wondering. Not for glory or to prove anything. Just a dad trying to pay for his kids' medical bills. He scrolled through images. A little girl with dark curly hair and a gap-toothed smile. Birthday parties. School photos. Candid shots of a child being a child, messy and happy and alive. She needs surgery, Jake said quietly. Her heart. There's a defect that's getting worse and the specialists say if we don't fix it soon, well, they use a lot of medical terms, but the bottom line is she needs help that I can't afford on a rescue center salary. So when this contract came up, offering enough money to cover everything, I applied. Honestly didn't think I'd get selected. Shadowfang's massive head lifted slightly, those glowing amber eyes focusing on the tiny screen in Jake's hands. She saw you on the news feeds, Jake continued, scrolling to a new image. They were covering the situation here, talking about the Emperor's dragon and the Tamer shortage. She got really interested. Started researching dragons, drawing pictures. He stopped on one particular image and even through the security feeds, every being in the observation deck could see what it was. A child's drawing, done in crayons and covered in glitter that had probably gotten everywhere in Jake's home. A dragon, rendered in purple instead of black, with silver stars decorating its wings. Clumsy letters at the bottom spelled out Shadowfang with the H backward. She made this for you, Jake said. Begged me to bring it along. She's 8 years old and she thinks you're the most beautiful thing she's ever seen. Told me I had to be nice to you, had to remember that you were sad and needed a friend. For the first time since Handler Brooks had died, since the world had shattered into pain and rage and endless grief, Shadowfang's eyes focused on something other than that pain. The dragon's head tilted, studying the crude drawing with an intensity that seemed almost confused, as if the creature couldn't quite process the idea that someone, somewhere, thought it was beautiful. She wanted me to tell you something, Jake said, his voice barely above a whisper now. She said, tell the dragon that being sad is okay, and that they're still beautiful even when they're crying. In the observation deck, Trevor's translator struggled to convey the emotional sound his species made. Commander Voth's facial plates had shifted to colors that meant she was witnessing something profound. Jake set down the data pad where Shadowfang could still see it, the glitter-covered drawing visible on the screen. She thinks you're beautiful, he whispered. And the dragon, for the first time in weeks, closed its eyes without fear or rage. Day 8 started like the others, with Jake entering the containment chamber carrying his thermos and data pad. But this day was different in ways nobody could have predicted. Jake had been pulling double shifts, spending 12 hours with Shadowfang and then another 6 filing reports, reviewing Handler Brooks' old training logs and video calling home to check on Lily. Her surgery was scheduled for 3 weeks out, assuming Jake could finish this contract successfully. The pressure was wearing on him. He barely slept in his assigned quarters. When he did sleep, he dreamed of medical bills and dragons and his daughter's gap-toothed smile. The station's medical officer had already warned him twice about exhaustion, but Jake had waved it off. He'd functioned on less sleep during the war. He could handle this. Except the human body has limits and Jake had been pushing past his for days. He settled into his usual spot in the containment chamber, back against the wall, coffee in hand. Shadowfang was resting about 30 feet away, the dragon's breathing steady and calm. The ambient music was playing, the same playlist Handler Brooks had loved. Jake started talking about his plans for the garden back home, describing where he'd plant the tomatoes versus the peppers, but his words were slurring together. The security team in the observation deck noticed first. He's fading, one of the handlers said, pointing at Jake's biometric readings on the monitor. Heart rate dropping, brain activity showing theta waves. He's falling asleep. Commander Voth moved closer to the screen. Should we wake him? Protocol says yes, another handler replied. Never sleep in an untamed creature's containment chamber. It's basic safety. But Trevor, the psychic specialist who'd been studying Jake's methods obsessively, held up a hand. Wait. Look at the dragon. Shadowfang had noticed too. The dragon's head lifted, those amber eyes focusing on the human whose words had trailed off mid-sentence. Jake's coffee cup had tilted in his hand, only his grip keeping it from spilling. His head had drooped forward, chin touching his chest. He was completely, genuinely asleep. Not the alert half-consciousness that experienced Tamers maintained, where part of their brain stayed vigilant for danger. Real sleep. The kind that comes when exhaustion finally wins. The security team's hands hovered over the emergency protocols. One button press would flood the chamber with loud alarms and bright lights, shocking Jake awake. Another would activate the suppression systems. A third would deploy automated barriers between human and dragon. Hold, Commander Voth ordered, her facial plates cycling through colors rapidly. Just hold. Shadowfang was moving now. The dragon's massive body uncoiled, scales whispering against the containment floor. Every being in the observation deck held their breath. This was it. This was when the dragon would strike, when the fragile trust would shatter, when they'd have another tragedy to report. But Shadowfang's movements weren't aggressive. They were careful, deliberate, almost gentle. The dragon approached Jake slowly, head lowering until it was level with the sleeping human. Shadowfang's breath, which could superheat air into plasma, came out warm and steady, ruffling Jake's hair. The dragon studied him for a long moment, and something in those amber eyes had changed. The pain was still there, the grief, but it was accompanied by something else now. Recognition maybe. Understanding. Connection. Then Shadowfang did something that made every expert in the observation deck question everything they thought they knew about dragon behavior. The creature curled its massive body around Jake, moving with a care that seemed impossible for something so large. 40 feet of muscle and scales arranged themselves in a protective circle, with Jake at the center. The dragon's wings, torn and tattered from weeks of self-harm, spread out and folded down like a canopy, creating a shelter. Heat radiated from Shadowfang's scales, the kind of warmth that could deflect military-grade weapons, now turned gentle and comforting. Jake slept on, completely unaware, nested against the dragon's chest like a child against a parent. "I've never seen anything like this," Trevor whispered, his translator barely functioning through his shock. "In 40 years of xenobiology and behavioral psychology, I've never witnessed a dragon display protective bonding behavior toward anyone except their original handler." Commander Voth's facial plates had shifted to colors nobody on her staff had ever seen before. "He did it," she said softly. "That human actually did it." They let Jake sleep. For 3 hours, the security feeds showed a man and a dragon, predator and prey, sharing warmth and trust in a darkness that had known only violence for months. Shadowfang's heartbeat thrummed through the chamber, steady and strong, and the dragon's breathing had synchronized completely with Jake's. When Jake finally woke, he experienced a moment of confusion that the security cameras caught perfectly. His eyes opened, saw obsidian scales inches from his face, felt warmth surrounding him and a heartbeat that definitely wasn't his own pounding through his chest. Most people would have panicked. Most people would have scrambled away, reached for weapons, triggered every survival instinct evolution had programmed into human DNA. Jake Reynolds just placed his palm against the warm scales and whispered, "Thank you." Shadowfang's eye, the size of Jake's head, focused on him. The dragon made a sound, not a growl or a roar but something softer. Almost like a purr, if dragons could purr. 2 days later the Emperor arrived. His radiance didn't announce his visit ahead of time. He simply appeared on the station with his entourage, demanding to see the human who had succeeded where 147 of the galaxy's best had failed. Word had reached the Imperial Court about the impossible breakthrough, and the Emperor wanted to witness it personally. Commander Voth scrambled to prepare, but the Emperor wasn't interested in ceremonies or formal presentations. He went straight to the observation deck, his advisors trailing behind him, and demanded the security feeds be displayed. What he saw made his primary sensory organs widen in disbelief. Jake Reynolds was playing with Shadowfang. Not conducting training exercises. Not establishing dominance hierarchies. Playing. They'd brought in a massive reinforced ball, about 6 feet in diameter, used normally for enrichment activities with large creatures. Jake would roll it toward the dragon, and Shadowfang would bat it back with one claw, careful not to hit too hard. When the ball rolled behind barriers, Jake would hide too, and the dragon would hunt for him with obvious excitement rather than aggression. When Shadowfang found him, Jake would laugh, genuine and delighted, and the dragon would make that purring sound again. It looked like a man playing with an oversized cat, except the cat was a 40-foot dragon capable of melting through starship hulls. "This is undignified," one of the Emperor's advisors said, his tone dripping with disdain. He was from a species that valued military precision above all else. "That creature is a weapon of war, not a pet. This human is making a mockery of Imperial property." The words carried through the observation deck speakers into the containment chamber. Jake heard them. He stopped mid-throw, the ball still in his hands, and turned toward the observation window. He couldn't see through it from his side, but he knew someone was there. Knew someone was judging what they saw. Jake's expression hardened in a way that reminded everyone watching that he was a decorated combat veteran, that he'd seen and done things that left scars the eye couldn't see. "That creature," Jake said, his voice quiet but carrying absolute authority, "is a being who watched their best friend die right in front of them. Your weapon broke because you only saw the tool, not the person wielding it." You saw function, not feeling. You treated Shadow Fang like equipment instead of like someone who could hurt and grieve and need time to heal. The Emperor raised one appendage, a gesture that commanded instant silence. His radiance stepped closer to the observation window, studying the human who had just lectured an Imperial advisor without fear. "Continue your work, human," the Emperor said, his voice resonating with power that made the deck vibrate. Then he turned to his advisors. "And the rest of you will learn from this. We have forgotten something important." 3 weeks after Jake Reynolds first walked into that containment chamber expecting to last maybe an hour, something miraculous happened. The station's engineers had been working overtime to expand the containment area, removing walls and extending it into an adjacent hangar bay. They'd created a space large enough for what everyone had thought was impossible just a month ago. Shadow Fang was going to fly again. Not the violent, desperate flights the dragon had attempted before, crashing into walls and tearing wings on barriers. Not escape attempts or attacks. This was different. This was a dragon who wanted to remember what joy felt like. Jake stood in the center of the expanded area, looking up at the massive creature perched on a reinforced platform. Shadow Fang's wings, still scarred but healing, stretched out experimentally. The dragon's eyes, those amber orbs that had held nothing but pain for so long, now gleamed with something that looked almost like excitement. "You sure about this?" Commander Voth asked through the communication system. The entire observation deck was packed again, but this time nobody was placing bets on disaster. They were just hoping to witness something beautiful. "No," Jake admitted honestly, checking the harness one more time. It wasn't standard taming equipment. It was something he'd designed himself, working with the station's engineers. Simple, secure, but most importantly, it didn't restrict or control the dragon. It just kept Jake from falling off. "But we won't know until we try." He approached Shadow Fang, and the dragon lowered its shoulder in a gesture that still amazed everyone who saw it. "Trust. Pure, simple trust." Jake climbed up, settling into the spot just behind the dragon's neck where Handler Brooks used to ride, according to the old training videos. "Take it slow," Jake murmured, leaning forward to rest one hand against Shadow Fang's scales. "We've got time. No rush." The dragon's response was that purring sound that had become familiar over the past weeks. Then Shadow Fang's powerful legs coiled and launched them into the air. The observation deck erupted in excited chatter, but Jake heard none of it. He was too busy experiencing something he'd never imagined he'd feel. The rush of air, the powerful movements of muscle and wing beneath him, the absolute freedom of flight. Shadow Fang started with simple circuits, getting used to having a rider again, remembering the weight and balance. But gradually, the dragon's movements became more confident, more playful. Shadow Fang did a barrel roll that had Jake laughing out loud, a sound of pure joy that the audio sensors caught and broadcast through the observation deck. They dove and climbed, twisted and turned, human and dragon moving together like they'd been doing this for years instead of weeks. "Look at the synchronization," Trevor said, pulling up data streams that showed both Jake's and Shadow Fang's biometrics. "Their heart rates are matched. Their breathing patterns are identical. This isn't dominance or control. This is partnership." Commander Voth watched with her facial plates shifting through colors that meant profound satisfaction. She'd been in this business for 30 years and she'd never seen anything quite like this. A broken dragon healed not through force or technique, but through simple human compassion. After an hour of flying, Shadow Fang landed gently, and Jake dismounted with shaky legs and the biggest smile anyone on the station had seen him wear. He was laughing, breathless, and probably a little bit in shock at what they'd just accomplished. That's when the formal summons came. The Emperor wanted to see Jake Reynolds in person. In the throne room. Immediately. The next day, Jake stood in the most opulent room he'd ever seen, surrounded by wealth and power that made his veteran's pension look like pocket change. The Emperor sat on a throne that seemed to be made of crystallized starlight, attended by dozens of advisors and courtiers from species Jake couldn't even name. Jake was still dusty from the morning session with Shadow Fang. He probably smelled like dragon, coffee, and the cheap soap from the station's communal showers. His boots tracked marks on floors that were probably worth more than his house back on Earth. The Emperor spoke, his voice carrying that resonant power that made the air vibrate. "Jake Reynolds of Earth. You have accomplished what the galaxy's finest could not. You have restored the Emperor's dragon, proven your worth beyond measure. I offer you the position of Imperial Dragon Handler. Wealth beyond your imagination. Status that will open any door in the known systems. A title that will secure your daughter's medical care for life, and her children's and her children's children's." It was everything Jake needed. Everything he'd come here hoping to achieve. Financial security forever. Lily's surgery paid for 1,000 times over. Respect. Recognition. A career that people would remember for generations. Jake looked at the Emperor, at the advisors waiting for him to fall over himself accepting, at the luxury surrounding him. Then he thought about Shadow Fong, waiting back in the containment area, probably wondering where Jake was. He thought about Lily back on Earth, counting down the days until her daddy came home. And he shook his head. The throne room went silent. Several advisors made sounds that their translators rendered as shocked gasps. One of them actually dropped the data pad he'd been holding. With respect, Your Radiance, Jake said, his voice steady and clear, Shadow Fong doesn't need an Imperial handler. The dragon doesn't need someone whose job it is to maintain a weapon. Shadow Fong needs a friend. Someone who sees them as an individual, not as what they can become or what they can do for the Empire. The Emperor's primary sensory organs focused intensely on Jake. You would refuse this honor? I'll accept a consultant position, Jake countered, and there was something in his tone that suggested this wasn't negotiable. I'll teach your handlers that these creatures aren't tools to be fixed. They're individuals to be understood. I'll help reform the guild's protocols, share what I've learned. But I'll need flexibility to go home regularly. Lily needs her father more than the Empire needs another employee. Several advisors started to object, but the Emperor raised a hand for silence. He studied Jake for a long moment, this unremarkable human who had just turned down wealth and power because he understood something the galaxy had forgotten. The other species think humans are barbarians, the Emperor said quietly, leaning forward on his throne. Emotional. Irrational. Too attached to sentiment and feelings. They think these qualities make you weak. Jake met the Emperor's eyes without flinching. Yeah, he agreed. That's exactly what makes us good at this. A sound came from the Emperor then, something his species did that the translators couldn't quite capture. But the advisors recognized it. His radiance was laughing. Accepted, the Emperor said. On your terms, human. Teach us what we have forgotten. The following months changed everything. Jake split his time between the station and Earth, spending 3 days a week with Shadow Fong and 4 days home with Lily. The guild's protocols were completely rewritten, with emotional understanding placed ahead of dominance and control. Jake trained new handlers, not in techniques of force, but in the art of patience and empathy. Lily got her surgery. It was successful. She recovered beautifully, and the first thing she wanted to do when she was well enough was visit the station to meet Shadow Fong in person. Jake brought her up on a day when he knew the dragon was in a good mood, and watched with tears in his eyes as his 8-year-old daughter stood fearlessly before a 40-foot dragon, holding up her crayon drawing. I made this for you, Lily said, her small voice echoing in the containment chamber. Daddy says you've been sad but that you're getting better. I think you're beautiful. Shadow Fong lowered that massive head until it was level with the tiny human child, and made the gentlest purring sound. The dragon's eyes focused on the drawing, on the purple scales and silver stars and the backward H in the name, and something in those amber depths looked almost like contentment. Jake's work revolutionized how the galaxy approached not just dragons, but all intelligent creatures used in service or partnership. The Galactic Taming Guild became the Galactic Partnership Council. Force gave way to understanding. Dominance was replaced with cooperation. And at the center of it all was a simple truth that humanity had known all along but the galaxy had forgotten. Sometimes the most advanced technology, the most sophisticated psychic abilities, the most refined techniques can't solve a problem. Sometimes what's needed is just someone willing to sit with another's pain. Someone who won't try to fix it or rush it or force it away. Someone who will just be present and patient, and refuse to give up even when giving up would be easier. The bond between Jake and Shadow Fong became legendary across the known systems. Not as a story of conquest or dominance. Not as a tale of human superiority or special abilities. But as a reminder of something profound and simple. That caring, even when it's hard, even when it hurts, even when it would be easier to walk away, is perhaps the most powerful force in the universe. That seeing someone, truly seeing them, not as what they can do but as who they are, can heal wounds that nothing else can touch. That sometimes the most human thing you can do is refuse to give up on someone, even when they've given up on themselves. And that a veteran single dad from Earth, armed with nothing but patience, coffee, and his daughter's crayon drawings, could teach the entire galaxy what it really means to connect.